Okay, I seem to have a voice, so I'd first of all like to thank everything that is good and holy for that. Second, in no particular order, the organisers for giving me this opportunity to speak to you today. I want to speak to you today about this relationship that we've been starting to build between what is written and what is heard, the seen and the spoken, as it were. So, my case study is the so-called Edwin Smith Surgical Papyrus, and I've put lots of information up here that I'll summarise very briefly. You can see it was purchased. We have no provenance, which is a huge loss. It would have been wonderful to know where this thing came from originally. It's also very large, so about 3 times the size of me if I lay down on the ground. And it's pretty much wonderfully intact. Look at that. As opposed to the first page has some damage and the second page, but after that, it's in really good order. In terms of the text itself, it's written, it's handwritten in ink, in black and red ink. In the script that we call hieratic. What we perceive is that there are 2 scribes in evidence for the papyrus. So one of them writes the majority of it. So all of the text on the recto and most of the text on the verso, and then the last few lines of text are written by a second scribe. The red ink is interesting. So we were talking about golden letters yesterday, and some red, I think, as well. The red is used for things like titles to mark emphasis, for key passages, again, for emphasis, for elements of the glosses, which are wonderful, and I'll talk a bit more at length about those, and occasionally for corrections as well. But it's used intelligently, and I'll show you an example of that in a second as well. So in terms of the content, very briefly, we have 17 columns, which we might call pages, I suppose now, with 48 or 47 and a half, the last one is incomplete, surgical cases, starting with the top of the head and progressing very logically down through the body. And then on the back, we have what has been called in a very disparaging manner a magical hodgepodge, meaning we have incantations. They are just as much a part of ancient Egyptian medicine as the so-called wonderfully pragmatic scientific surgical treatise on the rectal and should not be segregated. But there you go, it's often done. In terms of its date, it was copied in what we call the Second Intermediate Period, beginning of the New Kingdom, so about 1600 BCE, thereabouts. But the grammar and the language and some of the words themselves look much earlier. So at a guesstimate, maybe 400 years earlier than the date of the copy. I put up here, perhaps it was part of a temple library, but then it's in such good condition, surely people would have unrolled the thing, would have shown a little bit of a sign of wear and tear. The alternative is that it might have been deposited in a tomb, and we speculate about that. There's no information on its provenance within the papyrus itself, but on another medical papyrus now in Berlin, we have this enigmatic set of phrases describing where one of the texts that this particular papyrus was collating was found. So found in ancient writings in a chest containing documents under the feet of the god Anubis in Letopolis, a city in the north, in the time of the majesty of King Den, his dynasty 1, so right back at the start, 3000 BCE. Sounds very much like Sabine's, sequestered somewhere in an attic or under the church floor, that kind of thing. Now, of course, we needn't trust that exactly, but that kind of hallowed, secretive place to find the original text is interesting, at least. Lots of different translations, and most people who engage with this papyrus, they very often do it in conjunction with doctors and medical professionals because they want to get at what it says, its content, yes? And I'm not particularly interested just in that. I want to look at how it says what it says, if saying is the right word to use. So, an example. This is case 33. You can see this is from Sanchez and Meltzer's recent publication of the papyrus, that the cases flow one to another without separating them off. So what we have first is we have a title. Usually titles for the cases are in red, but because the scribe has just been writing in red, he wants to differentiate. So this is the intelligent use of colours. He writes his title in black. So practices for a contusion in the vertebra of his neck. The patient is always referred to in the third person. Then we have an examination followed by, in red, a diagnosis. Now, those of you who are reading this will notice that the wording in the examination is repeated almost verbatim in what you're supposed to say out loud. So you come along, I'm going to use Pippa because she's sitting right there. So you come along, you examine your patient, and then you must say, not to the patient, but out loud what you're saying. Yeah? So that active vocalization is interesting. And then there's usually a treatment. There are 3 different types of treatments available. This is the worst one, an ailment for which nothing is done. But there's also an ailment which I will treat and an ailment that I will fight with, which is interesting. Then in this case, and in most cases, there follow a series of glosses. So as for a contusion in the vertebra of his neck, this is what it means. And as for his falling upside down is what causes blah, blah, blah. And these things it explains. So that's the general kind of dynamic of the papyrus. The wonderful thing about it, if you're interested in scribal practice, is that it repeats words. So you get to play games like, how consistent is the scribe? You know? So if he's collating a text, is he imposing his own version of consistency upon it? And the answer is no. So this, in case 33, contusion, or to contuse, depending on how you interpret the word, appears 6 times, mostly written consistently, but here, down here in the gloss, we swap out the phonetic tall S for this little kind of durable long S, which isn't hugely meaningful, I suppose, but it's a deviation in practice within one case. Maybe it tells us something, we'll come back to that. And for those of you particularly eagle-eyed, then this little sign at the end, I'll talk to you about how the words are put together in a second, might be consistent all the way through until we get down here, and then it becomes a little bit more iconically recognizable as probably a mortar and a pestle. Yeah, so a contusion, something that grinds down on you. Yeah, and that's what the meaning sign is telling you. What's interesting about the scribe, one of the very first people to tangle with this papyrus, the American Egyptologist James Henry Breasted, who published it in the 1930s, gave the scribe a really hard time and ticked him off for being very careless and clumsy and making a lot of mistakes. But he's thinking about what he's writing as he's writing it. So he adds things in. Oops, I've missed out an R, so in it goes. He puts things in occasionally by mistake, but that's interesting too in terms of practice. And he will deviate occasionally. So even when he has a text to copy in a gloss, so as for this, he will make small adjustments to signs. And again, I find that quite interesting. So we're just observing that for the moment. We'll get to our case studies. I wanted to nod to the fact that it does come to this abrupt halt on the rectals. So I've put Breasted's comment up at length here. You can read it for yourself later if we're sharing slides. Breasted is most frustrated that the scribe just seems to have very petulantly put down his pen in the middle of this case and wandered off, thus depriving us of all this great knowledge. But even that is a point on the graph for scribal practice, that it didn't need to be finished. Okay, that's preamble. How is meaning created in this text and in Egyptian generally? Well, let's pick out a word. Here's one. And let's pull it out. And let's take it apart a little bit. So we have reading from right to left, as this papyrus does. We have sound signs to begin with that we can pronounce roughly degemi, something like that for this word. And then we have a little silent meaning sign. You see how I hedged my bets and didn't use our terminology that gets us into trouble. A silent meaning sign that sits at the end of the word, giving it substance is the way that we've been talking about it the last couple of days, right? So not just sound, but substance. So this is something to do with an eye. And I've given you a nicely inked eye so that you can see the connection between the two, okay? Now, what does it mean? Well, it occurs twice in our particular case that we're looking at here. And you can see that we've had some difficulties across the people who've worked with this papyrus and translated it, figuring out what it means. So some translators look at the eye and try to build it into their translation. It's a tricky word, degemi. Dazed, Jupiterus. Breasted, on the other hand, just ignores the eye and says, and he's looking elsewhere in the papyrus and getting his meaning voiceless from that. Now, those of you who are particularly eagle-eyed might have noticed that across the two writings, if you look at that last sign, the eye is slightly different, right?
Yeah. An
embellishment, a little flourish, something that we can just go, okay, a slight variation and ignore. Well, I would say not. I want to pay some attention to that. And indeed, I want to see how it plays out across the rest of the papyrus. So we have 9 instances of this word. Some of them clustering together in cases, and in no one case is it written consistently the same way if it's repeated. So it's odd that, right? And we do have eyes popping up occasionally, but we also have this little exhausted man, which I think is how you'll feel by the end of the day, or maybe even by the end of this talk. the whole kind of dropping down of the arms, very embodied as a sign to capture meaning. And wonderfully, we have a gloss as well, not the first time that the word appears, but later on. So, and the gloss explains that this is connected with being still. Ger can mean still or silent. Being depressed and not speaking, hence Breasted's translation. Yeah. So what about this little exhausted man as a meaning sign to nuance the word? How should we take it? How should we put it into our translations? And what difference does it make that there's a slight difference between the form of this little exhausted man and this form here? I don't know how many of you can see it. So David was getting us to do a little survey yesterday about similarities and differences. Big difference, small difference. If you're inking with a brush, then this is quite a straightforward line, but this is a sweep, right? So there's just a little difference. And yet, Breasted, with his lovely typescript, hieroglyphic transcription that most of us would work with instead of the original hieratic, sees no difference between these signs and uses the same one. That's a typographic convenience as well, but still losing a little thing. And again, in case 4, we can compare the same kind of thing. So a little seated man here again, quite distinct from this silent sign that sits at the end of the word that means to soften. So again, that kind of relaxing of the body, giving you the sense. Right, in terms of practice, what's going on? We've been looking at the nitty-gritty. We have a scribe, we have 2 scribes. What are they doing? Are they listening to somebody speak this aloud and they're writing it down? A master physician, as it were. Probably too simplistic, right? And even although we have instances where we seem to have mistakes that are made through hearing, I think that's not enough to convince me that this is a scenario. And of course, we have a separation of time where we have one scribe at least intervening, probably a whole series of them, writing versions of this text and separating it from our scribes who made our copy. But are all these people responsible perhaps for all these different renderings of the word? It's just been handled differently and substantiated differently down through the ages, maybe. But in terms of the actual nitty-gritty and getting this on paper, it fascinates me that, using a mouth sign here, that you can speak these words, isixu, degani, en medu, nf, but when you come to write them, you're having to make all kinds of choices that aren't really kind of implied just by this vocalization, particularly the addition of these meaning signs, and you have all kinds of choices there. You take something spoken and you make it into something that you can see with your eyes. And when you see with your eyes, you also have the power to speak it aloud, but you're speaking in a more empowered, enabled way, because you've also got that command of the meaning, the texture behind the words that you're written to. And it's possible that the person who spoke, if that's how this model works, never was a party to this process at all. Or it was. Lots of questions, not a lot of answers. So, thinking about how we handle this text nowadays and our practices and processes, as I say, it's very common for us to transcribe. So we take the difficult hieratic and we turn it into something nice and tight, and we make all sorts of choices in doing so. So for example, these little meaning signs we turn into nicer hieroglyphic forms. So no heads on these signs, but nice heads articulated here. And we might say, okay, we're going to see exactly the same thing when this word pops up again, ineri, in case 4. Here's the hieratic. Ooh, right, different determinative at the end. Sorry, slipped out. Meaning sign at the end. But this should be the same, right? Except it's not. But breasted was like, you know, the one is the other. And certainly other commentators have commented on the fact that these both write the letter M, the sound M, and there's no difference between them. So these are probably the same as well. But where do you draw your lines? Yeah, where is the difference meaningful? And it is a difference, it seems. Just brushing past this very briefly, this is a huge kind of set of meanings gathered together under these signs, which seem to alternate with each other. But it's interesting to see that the scribe goes through little phases of being consistent with one and the other and how they're applied. And I just threw that in there just now very briefly. And one seems to be slightly higher on the iconicity scale than the other as well. Very briefly, something that I played with many years ago was this kind of thing. Jordan was talking yesterday about the way that the Egyptians talk about writing and drawing with the same term. And these are drawings, right? You know, these are full renderings of human beings, some of them with quite a lot of detail articulated, as opposed to this kind of thing, which doesn't show you a human being at all. So you can vary how much iconicity you inject into signs, but some of them look really, really quite present and embodied. And this seated man sign, I don't know, hovers somewhere in the middle. So it's interesting to play with that. In terms of how it's used, I wanted to use it to lead into one more little case study, just to show you variations and alternations and how much meaning should we attach to these. So for example, here's our word in Egyptian for eyebrows. And when it's written first, this is in the same text, a main text and a gloss. The little meaning sign at the end are these two very imposing thick eyebrows, right? To show you what's meant. And in the gloss, they've become a little bit more elegant. These are like little kind of locks of hair instead. So probably not a hugely meaningful variant, but it's interesting. Different ways of writing the same word. But this is particularly interesting, seri, and I tangled with this for so long and used to puzzle over the fact that we moved from this little very broadly meaning sign, this man pointing to his mouth, to this, which is a complete and utter departure as another way of rendering this word's meaning. And you can see that translators again are quite diverse in the way that he handled this particular word. That's because we're getting it wrong. It's not seri, it's seri, as Breasted himself actually noticed and then poo-pooed and set aside. and we followed his hieroglyphic transcription ever since. But this is Seri instead, and suddenly its little meaning sign at the end makes sense, because ser, as a verb in Egyptian, it means to see what's coming before anybody else can. And its typical meaning sign, as we have it in the dictionary, is the giraffe, right? Because it can see what's coming before anybody else can. But actually, in our hurry to transcribe and to tidy up messy hieratic and turn it into what we expect to be in hieroglyphs, we ignore the fact that when we look at it in cursive texts, it can be a cat, a dog. I mean, these are not giraffes. I'm sorry. They're just doesn't matter what you do to the giraffe. And the dog is attested even in hieroglyphic inscriptions. So this is an article I published a few years ago. And that's what this little dog is doing here. Not to talk about necessarily the giraffe's ability to see what's coming, but that warning in advance, right? We've all woken up in the middle of the night and our dog is barking and it's dark and we think, oh my God, what's coming? So yeah, that kind of thing. So I've thrown a huge amount of material at you in the hopes that you'll pick up the interesting threads and make me explain myself at more length. But I finish with this. What was this text for? Because we don't ask that question all the time. We're so grateful to receive these things. Thank God we've got a manual of surgery. What can we do? Tell a story about Egyptian medicine. What was it? Was it, and Breasted played with this many years ago, a handbook for doctors for consultation? I love this, a medical professor's lecture outline something on. A student's notebook, hence the explanations and the glosses and the grappling with meaning. Was it something, and I used to say this to my students, that, there was a doctor, appropriating Pippa again, and here was the scribe saying, okay, so you're going to deal with somebody who's got, a big laceration in his neck, this is what you need to do, and you're instructing. But actually, no. There are voices in the text. Very often, as I say, the doctor is told to say something out loud. You should say it about your patient. And it's so important that here, the scribe Breasted gets very excited about this, the first asterisk in history down here. He's missed out this, then you should say about him, and he's written it up at the top because it needs to be there, that vocalizing impetus. But as I say, you're very rarely speaking to your patient. Patient be damned. He's just there with a contusion in his neck. You just want to be treating it. But the act of vocalizing is important, yeah, and occurs throughout. And to me, that seems to be the key. That you have, this is right at the end of our papyrus on the verso. This is the end of the magical incantations, which are split up, by the way. And you've got this idea of something that you write down and capture in visual form. And there's so much that you can do there with these meaning signs that you add on that are not vocalized, but capture learning and knowledge and embodiment capture. Yeah. And then this speaking aloud business. And I wonder if it's the connection between the two that's particularly important. So there you go, a little piece of home. So this is a completely different text. This is a religious text, a Book of the Dead Papyrus belonging to a woman called Naomi, who is so pure and justified in the afterlife that the god Osiris decides to give her her two eyes and her mouth. Yeah, and I've been using them throughout my presentation. And she holds them in her hand, this mystical combination of what you can see and take in visually, and then what you can articulate and perhaps explain and not just vocalize in a simple way with your mouth. And that seems to be the key. If you want to take it one step further, then I wonder if we can play with the idea that between this eye there and this mouth there, there's this second eye. Now, eyes come in pairs, so that's fine. It's okay to have two eyes. But this is also the Egyptian way to write the verb iri, which means to do or to make. Not to see, but to do or to make. And my students give me endlessly a hard time about this. Why does it have an eye? And you say, well, it's not really because of the eye. But maybe it is. Maybe there's something about the agency and doing and making and creating that is actually connected with bringing something into physical being so you can see it. Yeah. So there you go. Lots of disparate thoughts. I hope you enjoyed some of them. Thank you very much.